Okay, thanks, Ron. We're going to take a little bit of a change of gears here. Our next two sessions are going to be demonstrations on technologies that are truly disrupting businesses, impacting media, and marketing. So we have, first up is going to be narrative science and artificial intelligence storytelling. With us today is Dr. Kristian Hammond. He is the chief scientist and co-founder for Chicago-based Narrative Science. He's going to provide about a 20-minute demonstration of their company's product, which is Quill. It's an advanced natural language generation platform. So Chris is going to give us an overview of that for about 20 minutes, and then I'll come back up and we'll start taking some questions from the audience. After that, we're going to have a short break. We're going to do a chance to grab lunch and then come back and do our second demonstration for the day. So Chris, it's all yours.
Thank you. Am I on? Awesome. Thanks very much for having me here. And thanks for actually having your event here, because I'm across the street. It was really easy for me to get here, so I really appreciate that. I work in artificial intelligence. My day job is I'm a professor of computer science at Northwestern. I'm currently on leave, though, acting as chief scientist for narrative science. I'm going to talk to you about what narrative science does in a moment, but I want to give you a sense of a particular environment that we live in right now that you're probably aware of because of press around certain things. But I want to sort of help situate what narrative science does within that environment. So from and I have to make sure this works, yes. We actually had an interesting thing happen to us over the last 10 years. And that is we had a massive explosion of data, which is phenomenally good because we now have more data around how our businesses work, how our customers are acting, what people are buying, what people are selling, what's going inside our homes, and for anybody who's got a Fitbit, how much you have walked today. So it's a phenomenal amount of data. And it's what we wanted, because in general, when you make a decision, you'd like to make an informed decision. And in order to make an informed decision, you have to understand what's going on in the world. In order to understand what's going on in the world, you need data. There is, however, this odd irony. We have way more data than we can understand. I mean, way more. Actually, to give me a baseline for this audience, who here within the past month has looked at a spreadsheet? Who here has found that to be a rewarding experience? All right. We actually aren't constructed to look at data to begin with. We're not constructed to do analytics in our heads. But on the other side of the irony equation, the machine is. That is, we now have data that is clear and crisp and clean that the machine can do something with. And that has led to a wonderful thing, and that is we now have a set of systems which are loosely referred to as cognitive computing, artificial intelligence, machine learning. We have a set of systems that are able to look at all that data and do something with it. Another baseline question. IBM Watson, who's just heard of it. Deep learning. AlphaGo. OK. Good. So we have a set of systems, and they're all sort of under this one umbrella. And depending upon where you are in the information cycle, the umbrella is either referred to as machine learning, cognitive computing, or artificial intelligence. It's one umbrella, but there are different systems. And they're different systems because we reason in different ways. For example, we have a lot of systems in the world of predictive analytics that will actually look at numbers, find patterns in those numbers, establish what the equations are, and figure out that, in fact, Bob is going to have 24 pairs on Monday because they just seen a pattern. These are systems that look at equations, that figure out equations based upon numerical data. There are other systems, though, that do something very different. that will look at an example after example after example and do things like recognize cats, or recognize positions on go boards, or recognize when a car is about to run somebody over. This is a very different kind of reasoning, a different way of thinking about the world, a different thing that for us feels different and for machines feel different. And then we have things that look at language. And at this part, at this phase in terms of development, the things that look at language can do things like see a series of tweets, pull out every time iPhone is mentioned, and do some assessment of the sentiment associated with all those tweets. And so finding things where how many people have said, I love the iPhone, I hate the iPhone, I love X, I love Y, I hate X, I hate Y. What really taking a look at it from the point of view of I'm doing some, there's a text and I'm doing some analysis of it. These are all three very different kinds of reasoning. Now the kind of reasoning I care about, I have to click over on this side, is natural language generation. And in particular, I care about natural language generation based upon data. So given that all of you have looked at spreadsheets over the past month, I'm sure you're looking at this and you're saying, oh, I see what's going on. Even I can't tell what's going on. But what you want, really, is you want a piece of text associated with this. It says, while still slightly better than sales of the small light widget, sales of the overly large widget have been on the decline over the past year. During the same period, sales of the small light widget have been steadily improving. Right? So this, I would argue, is infinitely better than those numbers. But this comes directly from those numbers. And that's what I do. And the reason why I do it is because we just spent a ton of money on data. We decided we were going to gather data. We were going to store data. We were going to analyze data in order for us to be able to understand what was happening in the world. So again, baseline, big data, the term big data. It's more popular nowadays than it used to be. So we built up databases. We built up things in the cloud. We have business intelligence tools. And they all end up looking like this. This is, I would say, marginally more understandable than a spreadsheet. Marginally. But in particular, the lower right-hand corner is absolutely incomprehensible. It's incoherent. It's a sin that someone put this thing together and put it in the hands of real users and then was angry at those users because they didn't understand it. I mean, the relationship between technologists and real users is a loose one. This is the problem. This and spreadsheets is the problem that we were aimed at solving. That is, there's a gap between data and the audiences that need information. There's that moment where you want to know something, but you don't know where the data is. You don't know how to do the analysis, but you do want to know it. And you don't want someone to give you the data. You don't want someone to give you the spreadsheet. You don't want someone to teach you how to query a database. What you want is something that stands in between, that looks at that data, figures out what's going on, figures out what the story should be, and then turns it into natural language for you. For example, if you start off with financial data, that is, a view of what's going on in the market, you can turn that into this, an earnings report. And this is a piece of work we do for Forbes. For Forbes. And what we are doing here is we're taking the data associated with an earnings statement. We're looking at all those numbers. We're looking at what all the predictions from the analysts were. We're looking at the flow of earnings statements from the past, pulling that together to write a story. And when I say we, I don't mean human beings. I mean a machine. So the thing that you're looking at here is completely and utterly written by a machine with no human intervention. It was configured by a human being in much the same way you would teach someone how to write an earnings story. But it is not, on a regular basis, it is not generated using any help from a human being. What that meant was that from Forbes' point of view, during earnings season, they could track around 200 companies. Because these are not fun stories to write, by the way. They're not fun stories to write. They could track about 200 companies, but with Quill, they can track 5,000. Because instead of taking a couple hours for a writer to look at what's going on, figure it out, and write it up, it takes Quill a little under a second to write the same story. Now, there we go. That's a story in the broad. That's a story for media consumption. That's a story that's a single story about one company. But that's actually not the most powerful thing you could do. Imagine, for example, you had a different kind of data. That is, you had, for a lot of retail outlets, a lot of stores, a lot of restaurants, you had all their transactional data. And you had associated with that transactional data, data around the demographic profiles of every single individual who has made those who was involved in those transactions. That's actually the data that MasterCard has. And so we can take that data, and we do take that data, and we make this. A monthly report that goes out to different retailers that gives them an idea of how their business is doing, with a snapshot of their behavior, the behavior of their business is, how it's doing compared to last month, last year at the same time, and with the demographic information, is able to provide a little bit of advice about what they might do. That is, that there are demographic opportunities that are lacking that they have not responded to, but in fact they can respond to. Now that requires a combination of looking at the data and looking at the business. That is, having business rules around how to respond to what's happening in the world. And really differentiating between the analysis of here's what's happening from here's some advice based upon what's happening. Because in fact there could be different advice for the same situation from different organizations and for different organizations. The nice thing about this is that this can go to every single retailer. Every single one. It would be impossible for a human being to write this story. Or to write this story at scale. There just aren't enough people. But it's incredibly easy for a machine to do so. And the story that's being written, and this is actually important, the story that's being written is absolutely irrelevant, meaningless, and worthless to everyone in the world except one person. And that's the person who owns this store. And that's the beauty of using the machine. The machine can actually do things for people, for individuals, in a very focused way to produce what they can understand. And I would argue that most people who run dry cleaners and delis and clothing stores really don't want to spend their time looking at spreadsheets, but they're happy to read things. On the other end of the spectrum is something we do in financial services. And that is, you take a look at, if you take a look at a fund, I mean, if you've got investments, you will get sort of reports from the various places where your investments live, including if you've got investments in a fund, you'll get a quarterly report that says, here's how this fund is doing, here's how much money it's made, here's how much money it's made over time, by the way, and here's how it's doing against the benchmark. So if you've got an investment in an instrument and it did like 3% last year, that might sound fine until you realize everybody else did 6%, and then you're kind of annoyed. And so the ability to benchmark and understand investments from the point of view of not only how it's doing in an absolute sense, but how it's doing in a percentile sense, but also how it's doing compared to the rest of the world is crucial. People who run these funds, their job is to run a fund, is to make decisions about what is and is not appropriate for them to invest in. Once every quarter, they are asked to then report on that work. They don't like doing it. There are very few people who actually enjoy not only doing their job, but then spending a chunk of their job reporting on doing their job. And so what happens is the people who are fund managers will bring in additional analysts and additional writers, and once a quarter actually do the analysis of their fund compared to a benchmark, their fund compared to itself, their fund compared to its goals, its overall performance, pull that all together and write up a report. A report that is exactly like this. In fact, precisely like this. This, however, is written by Quill. And instead of taking 4 people 2 weeks to do this report, it takes Quill about 2 seconds. And so we end up being able to save a tremendous amount of time. And oddly enough, I mean, for people who are worried about disruption in jobs, and oddly enough, take over a part of the task that is despised by everyone involved in it. No one wants to look at a spreadsheet, see the difference between 2 numbers, and write a sentence about that. Machines are happy to do it because machines are happy. All right. Of course, there are other things that change in the world, and there are other things you want to measure. And this is just data for this is data coming out of Salesforce. And this data can become this. At every level of an organization, a sales organization, reporting that goes to the individual that describes how he or she is doing, what they could do to change their behavior, to their managers, to their managers, to their managers, all the way up the food chain. And looking at not only here's how this person's sales are doing, but actually here's how our customers are doing with regard to our products, here's how our products are doing with regard to our sales, and actually looking at the entire ecosystem of relationships with customers and salespeople, pricing, all of that, and be able to report on it directly, immediately, coming directly off the data. This is a free product. This one is a free product, by the way. You can just go grab this. Who here gets a report on who cares about how their website is doing? Who gets a report on it? All right, and it's generated by somebody who's looking at, for example, Google Analytics, right? This is Google Analytics data. I mean, there are charts and graphs also associated with it. But more important is that you can take this data and you can actually just hand us, Narrative Science, through a product called Quill Engage. You can hand it your Google Analytics credentials, and once a week from this point on, you will get a report on your website performance. And no one has to look at the data anymore because no one wanted the data. You just have to look at the report and understand what's happening. And the metrics you care about are what the thing reports and ends up reporting on. The metrics you care about are the things that it pulls to the fore. If there are things that are steady state, it won't even tell you about them, because why tell you about things that are unchanging? But things that are going better or worse, that it will report on, because the system itself actually knows not only what's happened in the world, but what is important to you. And it uses that as the driver for making decisions about information. And finally, Twitter. It breaks my heart that Twitter, it looks like it's just dying on the vine. But so be it. If you hand Narrative Science your Twitter handle, what it can do is it can give you a report on your behavior. It can give you a report on the things that are most popular that you've tweeted about. It'll give you a report on your followers and what they care about. It will actually give you a profile of you versus your followers. And it will actually give you suggestions as to what you might tweet about, because these are the things that your followers retweet. That is, it'll take a look and do an analysis of you and your followers and their behaviors and give you some analysis of what happened in the past, but also some advice about how you can respond if what your goal is to have more followers, to have more tweets. Okay. All of this is because we never wanted data. There is not a single CEO who said, if only I had a room that's super cooled and has 50 petabytes of data in it, wow, that would do it. We'd be golden. No one ever said that. Everybody wanted data because we wanted to be able to get insights about what's happening in the world and take actions. And this is actually our future. We will be working with machines that are like what narrative science does from this point on. They will do other things. They will do predictions. They will reason about the world and provide us with information about sort of the snapshots of what's happening. They will, in fact, give us recommendations, advice. But in order for them to work well and to be powerful partners, as opposed to bosses, in order for them to be powerful partners, they will have to be able to communicate with us. And communicate with us in a way that actually makes sense to us, that is, natural language. So that's what I do.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to open up for some questions here.
I'll sit.
I can sit for a second. You've been walking around quite a bit there.
I can't. I can't stop.
I can tell.
I wish I could. I really wish I could.
Yeah, definitely want to open up for some questions here. But first off, Chris, I just want to talk about, you were talking quite a bit about Quill Engage and your other service products that, all machine-based and all the great things that machines are doing. But could you maybe step back a bit and talk a little bit about the staff at Narrative Science and kind of the role it plays on the front end of working with clients and customers like us in developing the processes and outputs to get the desired end result, and then kind of what the timeline is and something like that. Right?
Absolutely. So Narrative Sciences has a fairly robust professional services group, and I mean, aside from being sort of professional, a lot of them actually come from the world of journalism. So this technology actually grew up of a partnership between engineering and journalism. And part of what we do when we have a new client is we really start off with asking the question of, what story do you want to tell? What do you want to communicate? To whom do you wish to tell this story? Do you want the story to be positive or focus on things that have to change? And really go through a process that would be almost identical to the process you would go through if you hired a new writer whose job it was to actually build out a communication plan for you. Now, in parallel with that, we always ask the question, given this is what you want to say, do you have the data that will be required in order to say it? That is, there are things that sometimes clients would like to include in a story that they just don't have the data for. And it's like, we can't do that. So Quill, by its nature, is a storyteller, but is a truth teller. And it needs to have the ground truth in order to do that. And so our initial interactions are really around the story, and then the data, and then it's iteration, as though you're getting drafts of things that someone is writing. It's like, and you go through and you go, no, I would not word it this way. And doing the same sort of markup, again, you do with at first an intern, and then it turns into a seasoned writer with regard to you and your tone, your goals, and your audience. And it really does feel, to a great extent, like you just hired a writer. It just happens that the writer can't talk to you directly. It needs our professional services team to give voice to it. It can produce content, but it can't ask you questions. And then when we get answers, we configure the system to match up with those answers. Depending upon the nature of, does the data exist, and do you understand your story, really the complexity of that, it's a time frame of from a month to 3 months. And the 3 months is usually when there isn't really the data there, there's not clarity around the story, or there's not clarity around the nature of the engagement. But we can do things incredibly quickly from the point of view of just taking new stories, new data, and putting together a Quill configuration. And what's sweet is once it's done, it's kind of done. I mean, unless you want the story to change, to morph over time, it will write that story forever and ever and ever. And we have clients for whom we write millions of stories a year. And we actually have one client in the staffing space where we write tens of thousands of resumes every single day. They're always lovely. They're always wonderful because the system actually, it doesn't get tired, it doesn't get confused, it doesn't get sleepy, it doesn't show up late to work. It just writes.
Great. Thanks, Chris. I'll open up for questions. The back there.
For global companies where languages may be different, are there any issues with that?
We've been English only for a while. We're flipping over to multilingual at the end of this year. We have essentially it's driven more by our clients than by the technology. So no, it's not for 2017. It's not an issue.
What was the toughest thing to get it to do? Like, there's a lot of things going through my head, so I apologize if this doesn't make sense, but intuition, there's certain things that humans theoretically do better than machines before the singularity starts. We'll find that out later, but I play a Scrabble game. Do you play Scrabble?
Yes.
And I play against the computer, and the computer plays the yes for 2 points, even though it should save it for a better rack later on and get more points later. What have you found that this computer, this system doesn't do as well as humans, or is there anything at all that it doesn't do as well as humans?
It's tethered to the data. I mean, there are those places where, if we do an earnings, there are places where we're doing an earnings report, and we would like to say this company is, this quarter has been terrific for this company because they're finally making use of an investment that they made 10 years ago. But we don't have the data for that, and so we can't say it. So there are these things that are outside the realm of data for us. Now, that actually doesn't bother us because there's so much data out there that's gone fallow, that's underutilized, that's unbelievably useful. And so we're focused on that. But even as we have existed as a company, we see more and more of the softer data, more qualitative data, coming into a form that we can use. And there are more and more companies that are doing things like language understanding that are getting closer. No one's even in the ballpark of doing a real language understanding system, but they're getting closer and closer and closer to the data that we're going to make use of. And as we look at things like the Internet of Things, the data is going to be crystal clear and clean. But it's the place where there just isn't data that we can't do anything. Otherwise, it's really not. I have to admit. I mean, this is. I saw a talk by the guy who's CEO of AT&T Mobile, and he talked about, and then we need information, and then I'll talk to my data science team, and they'll do it. And he said, but in general, the information we need is not rocket science. There are some places where you need really a lot of depth of analysis, but not when you're not 97% of the stories that we look at. It's more about analysis and some business rules.
Hi, I have a question. This is kind of futuristic, but maybe not. As more and more AI and language learning is coming on the internet, are you kind of afraid that the loop is going to close where computers are learning from computers, and what are you doing to prevent this? I'm actually studying machine learning right now, so I'm just very interested from your perspective.
It's interesting. On the university side, I actually just had a conversation with a student who wanted to do a machine learning project around finance, and he wanted to learn from the language that was in a couple of financial statements, really tiny financial statements. And I looked at it and I said, but these are generated by machine. You don't want to learn from things generated by machine because the space is too tiny for most machines. I think that we are seeing a coming world where we'll have machines that are tracking what's going on, figuring out what's happening, figuring out what to do, and they will talk to other machines. The thing that will be important there is they will have to have the capability at every single step of the way of explaining to us what they are up to. Because I don't mind if I call a self-driving car and I stumble into it, and instead of taking me home, it takes me to the hospital because, in fact, it's talked to my watch, and it sees that I'm having cardiac problems. I don't mind if it does that as long as it tells me. I mean, and it's that whole thing of living in a partnership with intelligent systems, I think, will be crucial if we're not going to be bullied by them. Because you don't want to be surrounded by things that know more than you and push you around and never explain to you why they're doing things. And that's a horrible world. But so that's part of the thing that we're doing to fight that. So there are systems that are out there that people are beginning to adopt that we are kind of a little nervous about them being adopted because they're black boxes that give you answers. And if you had a colleague that just walked into your office every once in a while and there was an outstanding question and just gave you the answer and then walked away, you would find that colleague to be an amazingly annoying. I mean, so this weird passive-aggressive person who's like, well, if you want, you can poke at me for hours on end and I'll tell you what's going on. Even if they're valuable in terms of their answers. And we don't want to see AI go that direction. And so that's a thing that we're genuinely fighting.
How do you feel about what's going on with Facebooks and bots? Are you guys moving into real time as well?
We actually have the model that we have, because every time the thing says something in a document, it knows why it said it and it knows what the next thing to say is. And so we already have a fairly strong interactive model, and we'll probably enter that world. Right now, the bot space, though, although it's interactive, it tends to be very tight interactions. It's, I want this, here it is. I want this, here it is. And we're looking at the different platforms to find a place where you can you can ask how something's doing and get the top line assessment, and then ask follow on, follow on, and follow on, and move through the space with the system. And that tends not to be the bot interactions we have right now. But it's a space that we all love, and we see ourselves as participating in that tremendously, and also providing a service. That is language as a service is something that we already do at the document level, but we want to be able to do it at the more microscopic level for bots.
Okay, time for one last question, okay? So, Lauren, your choice.
Thanks. Fascinating presentation. Thank you. I've just got a question linking back to the first panel this morning on empathy and EQ, inclusion, and so on. Do you think there may be a risk, or perhaps how do you see the future evolution of such a technology where, say, people looking at the data become dependent on what might be seen as sort of fairly binary data, but without taking wider things into account? Or would there need to be more inputs about the quality of the data?
That's an exceptional question. I think the nature of what we do is open to that tremendously. So I will give you the quickest of quick examples. The very first thing that we ever did with this technology is we wrote game recaps for baseball games for colleges. We did our work for the Big Ten Network. At the beginning of the season, the Big Ten teams are playing outside of the Big Ten, and sometimes they'd lose. And we were writing an AP-style story where we'd focus on the winner. And our editorial guy gave us a call and said, but these are being read by a Big Ten audience. So they don't care who won. They care how their team did. They care about their team. And so we jiggered things, and it doesn't change the truth of it, but it changes what's focused on. And what's focused on ends up being how great your team did, even though they got beat up. And that ends up being, we have this notion of angle in the system, and it means adjusting the angles to the audience. And so we have a very real sense of audience. It's not so much at the emotional level, but it's at what they need and what they want and what is helpful and how to communicate things. I think in the long run, as we get more and more data available to us, there will be something that looks more and more like almost a conversational interaction that is based upon understanding even the emotional state of the individual that the system is working with, and takes it into account. Because why wouldn't you take it into account? I mean, it's part of the facts of the world. And so, but I think that's a huge issue for us. The thing, I also think it also sort of blends into the issues of ethics in the machines. So AlphaGo is a system that plays, that Google built that plays Go. It is a better Go player than any human being on the face of the earth. They announced it. They had one big game, and then they had another big game against the Go master. And there was a moment where I was watching that, and I was thinking, it wouldn't surprise me if after this series, because it just beat the hell out of the guy. After this series, this guy said, "I'm not going to do this anymore." It could have crushed him. And I was like, didn't you guys think about that? Didn't you guys think about the impact, the actual impact on a human being that this is going to have? And I think we need to think of that as we build intelligent systems.
Great stuff. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Great questions. Thank you.